Welcome back to another episode of the Food for Thought podcast. I'm your host, Erin Hallstrom. For today's episode, we're keeping things in the family. I recently sat down and talked with food processing's newest addition, Andy Hanacek. Andy joined the team earlier this year after senior editor Pandon Mitrakakis' departure in December. Andy's fairly well known in the food and beverage industry, and we kick off the episode talking about that and so much more. We cover a lot of ground, including how Andy's been helping to inform an industry that combats misconceptions and misinformation on a daily basis. Having covered the food and beverage industry for nearly 20 years, Andy talks about what he's seen manufacturers do really well in the last 2 decades, and a few areas for improvement for the industry as a whole. And we cap things off talking about a few of the issues this veteran industry reporter is keeping a close eye on in 2023. Enjoy the episode. Andy, welcome not only to the Food for Thought podcast, but welcome to the food processing team. We are so excited to have you on the team and on the podcast. And I want to jump right in. There's a lot to talk to you about. You've covered the food and beverage industry for a while now. Where might listeners know you from? And can you kind of tell us kind of what your background has been in the food industry?
Sure, Erin, and thanks. I am extremely excited to be joining food processing here. We're a little bit into my start time already, and it's been great so far. I don't want to sound like Troy McClure from The Simpsons, but you may know me from such publications as the National Provisioner. It's a meat and poultry processing B2B publication. I was the editor-in-chief of that publication for about 15 to 17 years, full-time, part-time. I've also done some side work with a food safety consulting company for the last several years, and did a little bit of internal communications work for Tyson Foods for a short time. And but going way back prior to my time with the National Provisioner, going back almost 20 years at this point, I was the managing editor for Snack Food and Wholesale Bakery magazine. So my life has not been all meat and poultry. I have been in the snack food and bakery journalism business, if you will, as well. So I'm excited to kind of spread my wings here and learn about a lot of the other food segments, food categories, and the processing that goes on there. The beauty of food, of course, as we all know, is there is a lot of crossover in terms of strategies, concepts, and whatnot. So I'm really excited to bring the knowledge and the expertise from all the years that I spent at the Provisioner to this magazine. And the best thing about this role as it is one of my most favorite things to do at the Provisioner was visit the plants and see them in person, tour them, write feature stories about them. I've probably been in 100 to 200 different meat and poultry plants over my time at the Provisioner. So I'm looking forward to heading out to some of these other food plants and learning about the processes there as well. So thanks for having me on the podcast and on the publication. And I'm really excited and looking forward to it.
Well, you definitely sound like you've had quite a delicious job thus far. Now that you are on the food processing team, what is going to be your focus or your beat? I know you were talking about the plants that you're going to be visiting, but for the listeners, can you get into specifics about what you're going to be covering or trying to cover?
Well, I will be taking over the plant operations editor role, I guess, if you call it that. Technically, my title is senior editor. I know we live in a world where titles don't always mean a lot to some businesses and some companies, but I'll be focused on the plant operations side. So even if I'm not out visiting plants per se, I will be writing about all the different things that affect, any kind of processing plant operation, whether it be actual equipment and lines and food safety, even some, product development and ingredients. Obviously, there's a lot of machinery concepts and considerations that need to go into product development and whatnot. And just anything along those lines, anything that affects a plant or a facility, I'll be writing about and learning about as we go along, as things develop. So plant operations will be my focus. And as I mentioned, I'm excited about that. There's nothing better than getting out there and seeing how the sausage is made. To share a pun from that I've heard probably a million times from a variety of family and friends, and really the best thing about it is, despite the average consumer's belief, misconceptions about how the sausage is made per se, it's all made pretty well, and it's pretty awesome to see how not just sausage, but potato chips and beverages and baked goods and whatever else you might throw out there, candy. It's awesome to see how it's made, and not just the people that direct it, but the people that work in the plants as well.
I will say I have to agree with you there. I mean, I've been with food processing for over a decade. I mean, going on 15 years now, and the behind the scenes, the how the sausage is made. I've heard that joke too, going to like a process expo. I like to tell people, like, yeah, it's legitimately the show of how food is made, how the sausage is made. But the thing that I've enjoyed most about this job is you really do get to see how the thing that we consume, food, everybody has to eat, and it touches everybody's lives, that you get to see the work, and not just the work, but the people that go into, the stuff that we all consume, we all need. I don't know. It's a fascinating content, and just fascinating role to get to cover the people and the companies that make the food we all eat. So
I agree, and I just add, I the other day I saw, I guess it was a documentary or whatever it was, on PBS on the Union Stockyards here in Chicago, and one of the things that kind of hit the mark with regard to what you just said for me was, something that we all know. This is not news to anybody who's listening in the podcast, but how many people today, and how many people, even decades ago, think that all food comes from a supermarket. They don't realize that, meat and poultry come from an animal, and someone's got to process that. Well, potato chips, they come from a potato. Somebody's got to farm that. Somebody's got to, harvest it and just, process it and make it into potato chips. It's not like it was 100, 200 years ago, where everybody is actually attached to their food and knows exactly what went into it and how it was made, and all of that too. And it was just very interesting, and goes along with what you've said. And I think one of my I don't know if you'd call it goals, but one of my maybe ivory towers, high horses that I sat on, I don't know what you want to call it exactly, when I was with the National Provisioner, was getting the meat industry and the poultry industry to understand that, listen, I'm a B2B publication. I don't have consumers necessarily reading what I publish, although on the web they can, because, if they wander around and they search for, let's just say, Hillshire Farm sausage, they might find my story, and they might see what actually goes into the process. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think the food industry over a long time had gotten away from telling their story and educating consumers, because of just concerns about things getting taken out of context. And for a very long time, that was behind closed doors. And I love these shows on some of the cable networks that, actually take you into, how it's made. I think it's called How It's Made on the History Channel, and it's a few years old, but, it goes into a whole bunch of different food plants and actually shows it, and, doesn't say anything about the misconceptions or misguided ideas that go into some of these things, but it's just, I think it's fascinating. And I think many consumers, there's a lot of consumers who don't really care. They're just going to eat it and enjoy it. But there are a lot that share the same fascination for how these things end up in their refrigerators and on their plates and in their pantries. And I think the food industry has to take advantage of that and tell its story, no matter what it used to do. So anyway, that's a long tangent off of what you just said, but that was something that I really enjoyed telling those stories at the Provisioner, and I look forward to kind of continuing to do that now.
We had a guest a couple of years ago on the podcast that kind of spoke to that point, that manufacturing, and specifically food manufacturing, almost needs like better marketing just as a whole. Not only from the perspective of people think that, oh, food companies and they're so atrocious. From that perspective, so many food companies getting heat for things, what they put in their food, how the food is made, what have you. But also from a hiring perspective, like I think how consumers see food companies also lends itself to then trying to bring new people, new jobs, careers into the industry. It's like, yeah, if you have a whole generation or generations of people that don't think much of food companies, they're not going to want to enter careers that you could be really great at a technical thing or IT or whatever, and lo and behold, you could have a job, working cybersecurity at a food company, but because food manufacturing companies don't tend to market themselves or haven't always like, hey, yeah, this is what we do. We legit we put food on the table, that they're going to have a harder time getting people to understand what it is that they do for consumers and whatnot. You talked about like the stockyards and kind of the history of things, and I want to get back to kind of history and lessons. You've covered the food and beverage industry for the last couple of decades, and I'm curious, what issues still surprise you that the industry hasn't figured out or worked out yet?
Yeah, I would go to I would build off of what we just talked about a little bit. The marketing, the disinformation. Anytime something bad happens, the first people on site, and when I say bad, I mean bad press, the first people on site are the people who basically come in and shut the doors and no comment a lot of times, whether it be a food safety issue or a recall of some sort in that respect, or let's say there's an employee issue, an immigration a raid or some sort of issue along those lines. Let's say it's just I hearken back to I worked at the Provisioner during the pink slime crisis, the lean, finely textured beef crisis, and how unprepared the industry was in general for that type of viral video to get out there and just basically explode in popularity. Those types of things. I've been surprised at the food industry's general inability to be 100% ready to respond, or in some ways defend against a lot of that misinformation. I still see things that come up on my social media, my personal social media channels, that are years old, and it's ridiculous in many ways. Obviously the goal of eliminating all misinformation or disinformation, depending on which direction you're going, is going to be really difficult to do. But I feel like, some companies have done an excellent job at marketing themselves about the good things they're doing and letting consumers know. And yes, um, I've always spoken about that kind of silent majority of meat and poultry eaters, and there's a silent majority of food consumers that's a subset of, that are just, they're going to go to the store, they're going to go to the restaurant, they're going to order what they like, they're going to eat it, and they're not going to get caught up in a lot of the crazes and fads that tend to, come and go over time. And some of them are based on, you know, wacky science sometimes. Some of them are based on good science that just, the products that come out of them, out of that good science, aren't attractive to eat. They don't taste good, or they don't perform the same way. And it's just been very interesting to see the industry still kind of fighting that same battle in a very similar way to the way they've done for the last 15 to 20 years. And it's not to say that they aren't fighting the good fight, but I feel like in this day and age of over communication, the idea that you can just buckle down, put your nose to the grindstone, and pump out food that's awesome and wonderful and whatever, and it'll all take care of itself. That kind of mentality, just it's amazing to see that it still exists in some places. You've got to connect with consumers in general. And yes, you're not going to win over the extremists on the other side of the coin of what you're battling, whether it be health, or in the instance of meat and poultry, animal welfare, or environment, or whatever it is. There's extremists you're not going to win over. But there are folks in the middle that read some of that stuff and are easily turned one way or another, depending on the week or the month or the year. And with more firepower launched towards those folks in terms of, good information and sharing innovation and good news, and getting them to understand what it is you truly do, you can turn the tide and get those folks on your side, and be in a better spot. So I guess that in a nutshell, the fact that, things haven't changed too much in 15, 20 years with regard to how and how much the industry goes after the disinformation, the miscategorizations of the industry in terms of, general consumer knowledge and consumer ideas of what is in food, how food is made.
What are changes that you've seen in the last 15, 20 years that the food industry has made that has surprised you? So like pleasantly surprised you.
Oh, that's the easy one. Automation, hands down, has been amazing to watch evolve when it comes to food processing. Now, again, I've been in the meat and poultry industry for the last 15 years or so, and that has obviously lagged when it comes to automation compared to some other food categories and segments. So it has been a really amazing time to cover the meat and poultry industry and to be visiting plants. I mean, I know in the last 5-6 years, I've gone into poultry plants and I've actually toured the plant, and seeing that automation was coming to deboning of poultry and evisceration of poultry, and just cut up in general. I used to stop the tour guide and say, let me watch the manual deboning cone lines. Let me watch these folks work, because they were like machines, and it was amazing to watch them just cut apart what looks like a whole bird from the store, and just cut, and it keeps going right on by you. It was a disassembly line. Now, so much of that is automated, and it's amazing to have watched that transition. When I first joined the Provisioner, I had come out of the snack food and wholesale bakery magazine world, and it was an eye opener to go from snack and bakery into meat and poultry, where with snack and bakery, the entire pack off and packaging lines and cartoning and all of that was pretty much automated, and barely anybody in there in those rooms. Went to meat and poultry, and at that time, 15 to 20 years ago, everything was so differently sized, and the vision systems and the coding and the scanning and all of that. And when I mean coding, I mean barcoding, not like coating. Those technologies had not yet caught up to the differently sized products and the different mix of products that the plants were producing. So those were manual pack off and packaging lines in many instances, and it was just really amazing to see that. It was a kind of an eye opener. And then to basically over the last 15 years watch as the pack off and packaging industry or packaging equipment caught up to what was needed for meat and poultry was awesome. I used to tell people one of my, both Process and Pack Expo were two of my favorite shows. And I used to tell people all the time, it's amazing to watch these machines and these robots and all of that processing like Play-Doh at a trade show. And it's like, this is an amazing technology. When am I going to see it in a plant? And it was always a couple of years, because the meat and poultry plant industry was typically very conservative when it comes to those kinds of investments at that time. But it was always a couple of years, and then I would see it in a plant, and it was pretty amazing. But I used to tell people, boy, if Process Expo, Pack Expo, back in the day, Worldwide Food Expo, the poultry show, IPPE in Atlanta, if consumers, or even just general non-food industry engineers could come to one of those shows and see what these machines were doing, they would be in heaven. It'd be like a kid in a candy store. And I used to enjoy watching those machines do their demos at the trade shows, and then eventually seeing them in the plants. So automation has been a pleasant surprise and an awesome thing to watch, and an amazing thing to watch from the meat and poultry side especially. And now I'm glad to be back involved, because it's coming to beef, and it's not far from moving into the beef plants here with gusto pretty soon, because the technology is now finally catching up to the sheer size and the difference in size of the animals.
Well, you wrote about this sort of thing for our March cover story, kind of automation in the food industry, right?
Yeah, the food plan of the future. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll make sure to link to it in the show notes for the podcast. It's a great piece. Read through it numerous times. What's 3 or 4 issues in the food and beverage industry that have you most concerned this year?
Yeah, I would say the first one that has me most concerned is really a obviously, one, which is labor. This has been an issue for as long as I can remember in almost all of these industries, especially meat and poultry. Even before the pandemic, labor was difficult to get. And that goes back to what you said and what we kind of talked about, each of us, marketing what employment in the industry can bring to the table, and companies taking good care of their people. For a long time, many years ago, for several years actually, many years ago, we used to give out HR awards to some of the meat and poultry companies. We had a program for a while that did that, and it was at a time, honestly, the reason we did it, and part of why it then kind of fell by the wayside, was it was about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, and it was when the meat and poultry plants were really ramping up their HR offerings and different innovative ideas. So labor has always been an issue. The pandemic obviously made it worse, and now we're coming out of the pandemic here, and I even wrote about that in one of my stories. I did a meat and poultry story as to, what is going to stick around post-pandemic, because, the meat and poultry industry got just hammered by COVID, as we all know. What's going to stick around and what's going to kind of go back to the way it was. So the labor issue hasn't gone away. The big difference is that many of these plants have begun to finally see the investing in automation to eliminate jobs that are unfilled. So they're not firing people, they're just empty positions, and moving some of those other employees into better quality positions in the plant. That's something that is long overdue. And those companies that have already moved down that road are in a better place. So labor would be the the obvious one going into 2023, and I'm sure that's going to last for a very, very long time. Another one that I was thinking about actually the other day, as I was reading some of the analysis and news and things like that, the economic uncertainty. For a long time, I feel like everything I was reading from the national news and world news and things like that, and all the economists who know what's going on and things like that, was, oh, recession is imminent. Now I'm seeing, you read some of the annual reports from some of the food companies out there, and you can tell from the investments they made in 22 and early 23 that they were preparing for a recession, because the spending, was off a little bit over previous years. And of course, some of that also comes off of the gigantic demand post-pandemic for some of the food products out there. But I feel like I've recently read conflicting reports about where inflation is going to go and how that's going to affect the economy and things like that. And so, as a business owner, as a company out there, you don't really want to have to go through bad times, but it's almost better to know that it's going to be bad times or good times versus we're not sure. So I see a lot of mixed reports, mixed predictions, if you will, and out there that I'm reading. And I think that concerns me a little bit, because who knows which way it's going to go. And we've seen layoffs and, product cuts and things like that, and in different areas, and that creates a lot of uncertainty, and of course that hamstrings the industry. And then obviously the last one, which I probably don't have to go into too much detail, food safety is always a concern. The industry has gotten better over the decades with food safety, but finding new, better, faster, more efficient ways to ensure that the food supply, which, by the way, is safer probably than it's ever been in the U.S., but continuing to raise the bar on that and making sure that giant problems don't crop up and people don't get sick and die. Or we had the infant formula issue where supply was cut off because of food safety and things like that. So, disruption is not a good thing. So, food safety is always a concern. The industry's done a bang up job overall. There always seems to be some bad apples here and there, but generally speaking, the industry's done great. But continuing to raise the bar will always be something I'm watching, concerned about, and I know it's definitely something that keeps the food processors up at night all the time. And how do they get better? How do they ensure that their product is safe, wholesome, and something people love to consume?
Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Food for Thought podcast.
Thanks, Aaron. And again, so happy to be here. So happy to be back covering the industry. And looking forward to meeting everybody out there that's just, ready to work with me, ready to let me tell their story.
For everyone listening to the Food for Thought podcast today, thank you for tuning in. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and just about everywhere you can listen to a podcast. Be sure to tune in next time as we talk more about the stories behind the headlines of the food and beverage industry. Take care. Have a great day.